Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and talk about the 2018 MacBook Air and see how it holds up in the middle part or just in the 2022 year of general. Now, this specific MacBook came out in 2018. Now, what's very, very interesting was that this was actually a re-release of their older, it was kind of the reviving of the MacBook Air lineup. Before this, they didn't really have the MacBook Air of 2017, of 2016. They only had the MacBook Air of 2015 that they continued to sell for many, many years later. Now, when I look at the 2015 MacBook Air, I think that was a great MacBook. I think that thing still looks really, really decent. But when you look at the Retina MacBook Air, Apple did a tremendous job at reviving this lineup, so much so, in fact, that they're still selling the same exact body to this day and age. Now, the 2016 MacBook Pro is probably a little bit more interesting, but with this MacBook, the fact that they kept the same exact panel for the most part as a Pro lineup, they just made this thing look so much better. It looks still like a flagship MacBook. And even for the next 10 years, if you go and pick up a 2018 MacBook Air, even though this thing probably won't perform the greatest for that year, it's still going to look probably beautiful for a lot of people out there. So that was something that always kind of stood out to me. If you want to pick it up, I will leave links to some other MacBooks I would recommend in the description below. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of this MacBook, you can see that visibly, it still looks very, very current. This is a 4-year-old MacBook as of this point, and it doesn't look that dated. On the top, you do have the Apple logo, which, most people probably know of by now. And my favorite thing about this MacBook were the colors you can actually buy with it. It came in, I think, space gray, I think light as well, some kind of white color. But my favorite color was rose gold. That color, in my opinion, was probably the best color Apple has ever made, and I'm glad a lot of the MacBooks nowadays still have it. I just kind of wish that color went down for some other MacBooks like their MacBook Pros, but that is still a beautiful color for sure. Now, they did kind of reduce the number of ports from their previous MacBook Air to this one, but I will say that was a decent smart move. For a MacBook Air, people don't really, I would assume they just want as, cheap and as portable of a MacBook as possible. And now that they have the 14-inch MacBook Pros, they have a wider range of just different products you can choose from. So this makes a lot of sense to me why Apple chose this direction. Now, I will say on top of that, the 2 USB Type-C ports that you have in this MacBook, I think still hold up very, very well. So much so, in fact, like I mentioned with the, M1 MacBook Air, and even with the M2 MacBook Air Apple just made, they still have 2 USB Type-C ports. Now, we do have a MagSafe charger and other ones. Before this thing, like I said back in 2018, we already kind of went over that little, fork in the road where it was like, oh, we want more ports, we want more ports. Well, the MacBook Airs always notoriously had less ports than the MacBook Pros. So for this thing having the 2 USB Type-C ports, I really don't think too many people cared about it or were hating on it. I think most people were just glad they didn't just have one, like the standard 12-inch MacBooks. I was not a fan of those things at all. Now, opening this thing up, we do actually have that beautiful Retina display. Now, this panel was probably its biggest asset in my opinion because the internals, they really weren't that groundbreaking even at that time. But for this thing having this type of panel, in my opinion, is its biggest asset. And even since then, they haven't really done anything super crazy with the latest MacBooks. I mean, yeah, we do have True Tone on the MacBook Airs, but for the most part, for this thing having this type of display, I still think it looks beautiful, and I don't really have too much to complain about on that standpoint. We have the little MacBook Air emblem, below the display, which I think looks fine, but some people prefer this type of design over the new M2 MacBook Airs with the notches. Even the M1 Pro, with the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBooks, some people don't like those notches. Personally, I don't really care too much, but some people probably like this design over those ones, which that in and of itself is actually very, very interesting. Now, on the bottom of this display, on the lower half, we do actually have the standard keyboard on this thing. Now, there is no touch bar on this MacBook, which most people probably actually prefer. I think a lot of people don't really like having this type of, touch bar and everything like that. I still personally use some MacBooks that do have touch bars, and I don't really find myself having that big of a difference or that big of a deal from having a touch bar or not, but best believe that for a majority of people out there, a lot of people preferred not having that touch bar on their panels or on their specific MacBooks. So that's probably a big thing to keep in mind as well. We have that standard keyboard too. Now, this keyboard is a little bit, controversial, like I mentioned. Some people don't like this keyboard, mostly because of the lack of travel. These MacBooks did have that type of issue. So if you don't like those original butterfly keyboards, you're probably not going to like this specific keyboard on this MacBook. So that's probably another thing to keep in mind. but you still maintain that really big trackpad, which this is also another controversial thing. Some people like it, some people hate it. Personally, I think I'm indifferent. I like having this type of big trackpad, but I think a lot of people have the ability or like having the ability of having a little bit of a smaller trackpad, but at least with this thing, it's not like the whole entire bottom half, but it's still pretty big for the most part. So in terms of the body, that kind of covers it up there. Now booting this thing up, this MacBook is actually still somewhat relevant. This is the lowest supported MacBook Air on the latest beta of macOS software. So the latest beta of macOS, as most of you know, is that new, macOS version. Now I will say for a majority of people out there, they're not going to be installing the latest version of macOS as soon as they get their MacBook. What I mean by that is there's still a lot of people who are going to be rocking a 2015 MacBook Air that just got the last version of macOS, which was macOS Monterey. With this latest version of software, I think it's still going to be having a little bit of a slow turnaround. So a lot of people are still going to be sticking with, the latest MacBook, but they're not going to go ahead and install the latest version of macOS on it. So I think that's totally okay. I'm excited about the next version of macOS. I think it's going to be awesome, but I would not recommend installing the beta. But the other thing is that with the latest version of macOS, which is macOS Ventura, it's going to be very interesting to see how this MacBook holds up on that version of software, as well as how long this MacBook is going to be holding up. Is it going to be getting the next version of macOS after Ventura? I'll love to see it, but after rocking macOS Ventura on this MacBook Air for about the last, I would say, 2 weeks, it really hasn't been that crazy bad of a performance, I'm going to be completely honest, and for a first beta, I'm actually pretty surprised how well it's performing. But like I mentioned, do not install this version of macOS on any MacBook Air, whether your MacBook is the latest one or this one. It's not worth it just yet, but I am somewhat curious because this is one of the lowest performing MacBooks that are supported on this version of software. And if this is doing well, I'll be curious to see how the other ones are doing as well too. Now this thing internally had that 1.6 gigahertz dual core CPU inside of it with the Intel Core i5, and again it really wasn't meant to be the best performing MacBook of that day and age. It was just supposed to be a budget tier MacBook you can purchase. It was mostly suitable for students, and I will say even in this day and age, the fact that it does have those Thunderbolt ports, the fact that it does have a little bit more ability with it connecting to multiple monitors and different things like that, I like having that ability. You had 8 gigabytes of internal RAM for the base model, but you could configure it up to 16 gigabytes of RAM as well. So that's kind of another advantage you had on this type of MacBook. Now I will tell you when it comes down to it, this isn't really the MacBook I would recommend everyone to purchase, and if this is the only MacBook you could buy, then I would say go for it. It's not a bad MacBook, but do keep in mind that its a lack of software support probably for the future is going to put this phone in a somewhat weird situation. But what I will tell you and what I love telling everyone is, if you can, I would probably recommend buying the M1 MacBook Air. That one compared to this thing is a substantially better machine in pretty much every single area. Anytime I looked at the M1 MacBook Air and, I look at it, I do anything with it, it still performs so well that it's not even funny. Now that we have the M2 MacBook Air, it may just make a little bit more sense to go and purchase that thing, to be honest, but I still think the M1 MacBook Air is much better than this thing, but that doesn't mean this is a bad MacBook. I think this is still a good MacBook, but for a lot of people out there, you are going to hit the ceiling fairly fast with this type of MacBook. It doesn't really have, the latest and greatest. It has, the same amount of RAM as the latest one, but the chipset inside is so much better on the M1 MacBooks that it pretty much just makes sense to go and buy that one over this one, to be honest. So that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.